Hello, everybody, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. In today's episode, we have Aidan Kenneth, as I learned, it's an Irish name. So, hey, Aidan, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So, you are the creator of Optic, and what we want to talk about today is a little bit what Optic does, mostly what it does, not so much what it is. And it's in the space of managing and evolving APIs. And I find that fascinating because, of course, it's dear to my heart, right? On the one hand, I think APIs are important. On the other hand, they are changing all the time. So, how can you manage that? Can you give us just a little intro about what Optic is, what it does, and like what even drove you to creating it?
Yeah, definitely. So Optic is this really sort of early attempt to try to make sure that as the world is getting more complex and as more APIs are getting released every day, big monoliths are getting broken up into tinier pieces and tiny to big companies. There's all these public APIs. And what we've realized over the last couple of years is that it's become really, really hard to manage these APIs and all of these different relationships. Like it's not just one API, it's all the relationships between each API producer and all of their distinct consumers. And a lot of people talk about like breaking changes and wanting to prevent those things from happening. I think a lot of users have at least a story or two where there's been a bad outcome from a breaking change. Uh,
Probably many more than a story or two. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share some of these, but I keep a bank of the most interesting breaking change stories I've ever heard. But yeah, we think that if you look at sort of what's been important over the last couple of years, it's switched from like versioning our code to versioning the behavior of our APIs and sort of the contracts that they have. And we have really nice tools like Git and GitHub and GitLab and all the other code hosts that help us be thoughtful about the code changes we make. We don't really have anything that helps us be thoughtful about the API changes we make. So we like to say, without getting into too many details, that Optic is just this nice developer-friendly tool that makes it so that every time you change your API, those changes are part of code review and you get to talk about them before they get deployed to users. We just try to give you the right context to understand what's changed, who it's going to affect, and let the team talk about and decide what they want to do instead of discovering long after something's been deployed that it had this externality, this break that they didn't expect.
Yeah, that's certainly a good story to tell, I think, because there are definitely these stories of breakage out there. And just recently, I had, and in that channel, I had Hiram Wright of Hiram's Law, right? And I think he's also one of these interesting people in that space where he says, even if you try to manage evolving your APIs in predictable ways, people will still depend on things that you said you shouldn't depend on that, but they still do. So breakage will still just happen, right? So then I think we all are curious maybe to hear the top one or two from your little stash of API breakage stories.
Well, my favorite one, and I'm gonna say what it is, and no one's gonna believe this is a problem, but I'm just gonna say it, and then I'll explain how it became an API breaking change. Uh, a specific sports league somewhere in the world, I won't say which one, got a lot of money, and they decided to update all of the cameras on the field, and that was an API breaking change.
Okay, yeah, that always now you're kind of like rattling, right? It's like where could that be? What comes out of these cameras? Where does it go? Who depends on what? So give us one more hint that maybe may help us to figure out where you're
So,
going with this story.
so the movie Moneyball, this idea that you can use statistics to find opportunistic players to buy. It's all powered by stats, and some of the stats are things that are like qualitative, like specific things about where this player came from, and like put it in some big regression, and other things like very, very, very based on numbers, like how fast they threw a ball or how far they ran, and these kinds of things. So this sports league, to remain unnamed, upgraded their cameras, thinking that they were going to get better data, and they actually had different levels of precision and different ways of averaging um, the speed and all these other things than the cameras they were using before. So all of the people who are trying to basically think of them as like the stock traders of the sports leagues had all these complicated algorithms to try to figure out who to buy and sell. And we should never talk about people in that way, but if you're professional sports player, then I think it's okay. Um, and it broke all their algorithms. Like the way they were making their most important decisions were broken for like several months. And that's just like a fascinating thing. Like you wouldn't expect upgrading cameras, or this also happens in manufacturing. I talked to a company that has sensors that go into manufacturing plants, and they upgraded some of the internal components. And then the people who are reacting to the outputs from those sensors, it's still a number. It still looks the same in the API, but it broke hardware, like real things in the real world that cost many thousands of dollars because the precision was different than what they had sort of coded against. So all these things, back to what you were saying with all the observable properties being important, like these things don't seem like they should affect the API, but they can have magnificent effects on the API. It's also integrated, and there's real world things that change the API behavior in really, mischievous ways that you wouldn't necessarily think to write code or test against.
Yeah, and I was just like, when you were telling that story, I was of course also thinking of the stock market, right? Where it's the same kind of thing. Like you have a lot of data flowing and a lot of really important and really expensive algorithms watching that data and making decisions, right? And I think there over time, people learned that, it's good to put in some safety stops, right? So if things seem to behave in really, really strange ways, they just stop trading.
Yeah.
But I guess in that case, right, that kind of safety stop wasn't in there, so people just operated under the assumption everything's fine, but it wasn't. But did you see any kind of actual, like bad player trades being made, or was it just like people getting upset that things didn't work anymore?
I think there were a few early, and then what I understood from hearing sort of postmortem is that people very quickly stopped, and there was a lot of pressure to fix the problem. So it did eventually get fixed, but like it wasn't go back to the old cameras. It was like give people time to upgrade sort of how they're doing these calculations, like back test it a little bit and update some of the old historical data to be more like the new numbers. Like there was other interventions I think they took, but it's just, to me, it's just so like we talk so much about APIs as this like digital thing, and I think more and more they're connected to real world items, and that's not something that a schema check would detect, and it's not even something that you could even imagine running a test against. It's almost like you need to tell all of the consumers of that API that this specific field is going to behave differently, and there's not like a good way. There's not like a channel of communication to just annotate, hey, this thing's going to be different now. I think so much of this API problem is just about helping humans talk better. And it's a lot less about type systems and all the other things that you might be able to go deep on for a long time. It's just human communication and making that better between people.
That's the part of your story that I really love, because to me, in the end, right, APIs really are, of course, they're technical things, right? But in the end, they are a device how two development teams collaborate. And maybe they never actually collaborate, so to speak, in terms of sitting in the same room, but they get stuff done together. And it's important that when things change, that maybe they have a little conversation about that. So that part, I think, is really great, because it kind of takes us back to the reality of APIs, not just being these technical things, but being these connecting glue in that worldwide network of kind of decentralized teams. So tell me a little bit how that change actually, in your view, right? How that would have been managed better to avoid that breakage that happened.
Yeah. Well, first of all the APIs would have been documented. So that would have been day one, not just this implicit contract, but there'd be something that looks like a specification, preferably inside of Optic, but there's a lot of other ways you could look at that. And then when someone, recognized this, hey, we've upgraded these systems, it's going to have an impact. What's missing is you just don't know how that endpoint is being used. If you're the developer, you're the producer of that API, you're just thinking this is a stats endpoint. Like that's I'm coding a stats endpoint. I'm returning numbers from a database. You need to let your consumers, when they start using your API, tell you about their use cases. This is especially important for like private APIs and internal APIs. I think if you're a public API like a Twilio, like you're going to hear you're overwhelmed with data, so you're going to be able to find the averages and understand the use cases. When you're doing these internal or partner APIs and sort of smaller groups, you really need this direct relationship with consumers. And it shouldn't just be, I'm going to start using your API. If I start using your API, you should get a notification. I should have to tell you why I'm using it or how I'm using it. And then when I go change that field, I can see like, oh, like this is being used to power some sort of regression that they're building to detect what player they should make a bid on. And then I'm at least conscious of it. And I can send you a message about that specific field and say, hey, this is going to change in this way. Here's some examples of the new data. Let's talk about it. And here's when it's going to happen. And I think ultimately, it's never something you're going to solve with like a better kind of spec or a better type system, but you need to create these channels where the conversation kind of goes both ways. There's like the API itself, and there's like the meta channel that is talking about how the API works and how it's changing. And both of those things are like important for to be like above the surface. And I think that's the part that's like missing right now. What we're trying to build with Optic is like that meta channel where these conversations can happen, and where like this ledger of all of the history of this API lives on next to the API itself.
I find that fascinating because at some level, right, it's almost, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but it's almost like against kind of the API gospel, which is saying that, if I have an API that's, let's say, perfectly documented and things, right, I should be able to not care about who consumes it. Because then I don't have to talk to those people, and I can have many of those people using my APIs, and everything's going pretty great, right? And I think at some level that still is at least the ideal. Maybe it's not something where people would say, sure, it works like this, but it's still this ideal that the API kind of completely replaces that channel that you're talking about. So do you think that channel is always necessary, or in special cases, or like how do you see that relationship between, that additional channel and then augmenting basically that technical API channel?
I think there's a lot of idealism around like there's been a ton of approaches over the years about making APIs themselves evolvable and like putting that data inside of the API, different headers, different things with hypermedia, different kinds of sunsetting guidelines, or protocols that like explicitly talk about deprecation. Like there's a ton of things we've tried, but I think ultimately like you need this side channel in cases where the number of consumers is small. And I think that this initial kind of assumption that you have to make your API work for everyone and you can be agnostic to kind of what their needs are makes a lot of sense in the first generation of APIs, when it was all about public APIs that were being used. Public APIs are now like less than 5% of the APIs on Earth. Most APIs have a small number of consumers that you have a direct in-person real world relationship with these people at some point. Like you see them at least once every year or two. And it's like, do you want, like, I have a way that I treat strangers. I wouldn't treat my sister that way, but we exchange a lot more. And like this idea that there's only one way of being, and we should strive for the lowest fidelity version that requires the least communication and the least kind of coordination, is like not true in relationships, and also shouldn't be true in these closer API relationships when you have just one team consuming, or two teams consuming, or three major partners consuming. I think knowing who these people are and recognizing that this isn't just a protocol is a big part of it. And I'll die on this hill of putting humanity back into technology. I think it's really important.
And it's not that I want to tell you don't do that. And it's a great point that you're making. So a little while ago, I talked about the difference between private partner and public APIs, and it was really interesting because like some people like objected on like very fundamentalist terms almost, and saying there shouldn't be a difference, right? If you make a difference, that's a bad idea. And that's actually what I thought a little while ago. And then in my mind, I didn't really mention the things that you're talking about, but the things that I mentioned was also that, for example, if you have a private API, right, shared with relatively few people, you can probably also rely on more of a shared model that you have with them, maybe a more complicated model because you all work in the same company, right? And for a public API, you probably want to have like a more simple model because, well, people just want to use that simple slice and it should be easy to understand. So I think there are these different ways how you can design different classes of APIs. And I find that idea fascinating, that also on the kind of management level, there is this difference that maybe is relevant in terms of who's the population, so to speak, the user group that you're working with.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I think it also, when you think about smaller groups, it allows you to learn faster. So this is something that you and I have talked about this, but like at a lot of big companies, the way they avoid breaking changes is they never change anything. And that comes along with its own cost. It comes along with not being able to incorporate new learnings into our domain model. And it comes along with all of these new fields that people might depend on in the future that they shouldn't, because they're not really part of the the current zeitgeist of how we think about the world. And they're also more maintenance. So like, what is there's a breaking change in that too, is that your team is less effective. Um, excuse me, and your APIs have become more complicated. So it's not the same kind of breaking change, but like if ever, pretty much every, not every, but a large proportion of the Fortune 500 companies in the U.S. Most of their internal teams look like this, where they sort of are afraid to change anything, and that kind of apprehension is something that helps keep them more evolvable, but it's not the only way they could be more evolvable. And I think that it's one of those things where like you can always play to win or play to not lose. And that approach is like playing to not lose. There is a play to win strategy where you get to learn quickly, update your APIs, pay off debt as you are able to, and all move faster together. And I think like we always just need to look at like, are we playing to win? Are we playing to not lose? And I think the strategy in both are very different.
Yeah, I like that view, but in my mind, so one thing I find interesting. So what you're saying is, in part at least in those scenarios, that people kind of want to change things, but they're afraid of doing it, so they don't.
Well, they
But on
don't
the other
know.
hand,
Sorry, I was
yeah,
just say, if you're gonna you could delete a field, and that's like a breaking change if you delete a field from a response. Like that's what the rules of the internet would say. But if nobody in the company, none of those three consumers you have use that field, it's not actually a breaking change. So like a big part of our ideas and our project is like to let you understand this relationship with your consumers, so that you can make those decisions and actually say, here's the 5 breaking changes you should make this month, because it's going to help you pay off some debt, and it reduces your surface area, and no one's using these other things. So like if they can be retired, they should be. And I think that's sort of the other component of this that isn't often talked about.
yeah, and I like that view, but it's still like you're kind of starting from the, I think, relatively optimistic assumption that teams are willing to make those changes. What, on the other hand, right, what I see a lot in large organizations is it's kind of still in the old ways, right, where like these APIs are more treated like projects. So somebody, somebody builds it, and then it's just sitting there, and nobody kind of owns it or manages anymore. I mean, it's running, but nobody feels responsible for it. And I think in many cases that is also one of the reasons why these APIs often don't change anymore, because just nobody's looking at the feedback. Nobody knows how it's used, right? People are scared because they don't know how it's used. So they're just sitting there, and everybody hopes that, they're good enough. And if they want to do something different, then that's typically, right, a much more complex process probably than it should be.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a
Yeah.
lot of, I think in that case, there's a lot of kind of organizational and historical baggage to this, like that they're not really used to this cadence of making more smaller steps instead of like every 2 years, it's like everything
One
rolling
thing.
up in one big change and pushing it out.
Yeah. Well, I think a big part of the reason why waterfall still exists is because in the absence of good communication channels, it often is very effective. Like one of my
Yeah.
personal worldviews, which I'm kind of ashamed to believe, but I'm pretty sure it's true, is that the things are the way they are for good reasons. Because anything that's like robust enough to have lasted for decades is it's like the Lindy principle. Like it's going to stick around longer because there's something about it that gives it fitness. So things are the way they are for good reasons, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean you have to like the reasons, and also doesn't mean that those reasons can't be changed by changing the components of the problem. So I agree with you that there's a lot of cultural organizational stuff there, but if you can help people sort of understand how all the pieces of their systems interconnect, that's a big step forward towards being able to plan, being able to coordinate. I love sort of the stories of teams that have gotten really far by mocking specification and then building both the consumer and the producer. Like there's all these kinds of stories that are like giving me some optimism. And I hope that basically a big part of making software evolvable in my mind is understand, like when we say make things evolvable, we really mean give us the ability to change it without the downside of changing it and that affecting other people. So like it's sort of saying I want my cake and eat it too. And that's what makes software, in my opinion, evolvable, is you're able to incorporate your learnings really quickly. And you learning something doesn't mean that other people are now set back.
That's very true, and that brings us to our title, right? Move fast and don't break things, and I love that. But I mean, what you're saying, I think, is totally true. Saying, that like there's a reason why things are the way they are, and waterfall, there's a lot of like how you can explain those things, and that alone, I think, would be a fascinating topic to cover, but would take a long time. There's a lot of factors going into that. History of IT and all of this, right? But I think what we also see is that nowadays a lot of organizations are seeing that just the world around them has changed enough and forces them to change at a quicker pace than they're used to, that they have to rethink that, right? Even if there is a good reason they have done that like this for quite a while, at some point you have to start thinking about how well will that model serve me 5 or 10 years from now. And I think more and more organizations are saying, maybe not so well. Right? Maybe I'll be the really slow one, and others will be able to catch up and pass me. And I think that is why we see so much interest in that space, because everybody wants kind of that one thing, right? Move fast and don't break things. And I think that's the magic formula that everybody is hoping to somehow get to.
Yeah, and it does apply to APIs. It also applies to like pretty much everything else in an engineering organization. Like you want to be able to experiment, put stuff out, see if it works, and move forward. And I think we still are like in the beginning of this part of history where systems independently deploy, where there's different things that aren't all shipped together that have to work well. And I think it's like just like there's a lot of like skeuomorphism in APIs, like get, post, forms, or pieces of paper you'd put into a pneumatic tube and send down to some other office on Wall Street, and they'd send it back. Like that was a request, you got a response back. Sometimes you sent them in batches. Like we have all this skeuomorphism that's sort of come from the real world into the API world. I think as we learn to make evolvable systems, I'm optimistic that things we learn about that in the software world will make it back into the real world too. That's like very meta. We could talk about that for 3 hours, but I think we're still as a society just like figuring out how to change as we learn, and that's like why things feel like they're slow to change. And this is a problem that's like persistent, and it doesn't just exist in technology. So that's, to me, what's exciting is like APIs are a place where we can learn how to solve some of these problems and how to at least approach them. And I think that comes back into society, just like these metaphors of forms and requests and pneumatic tubes have come into the API world.
I have presentations where I have pictures of pneumatic tubes, because that's how I even had some. I'm better than that. I even had some with cuneiform on it, like claiming that, it's like what actually got us to even start writing was basically kind of human-oriented APIs, right? Somebody needs to write down, this is how much taxes this person paid, and another person needs to be able to read that so that they can say, okay, or like, give me more money. So I think, I mean, these processes, I think they don't really have that much to do with technology themselves. I think they are just a way of how you build complex systems of interdependent, but kind of independent parts, like this weird thing where, well, everybody needs to work together somehow, but then again, everybody is kind of like has the autonomy to do things differently themselves. And I think that's always the struggle that we have that makes things so complicated, right? On the one hand, we're building these dependencies and we need them, but we also want some autonomy. And I think that balance is just a really hard thing to find the magical balance.
Yeah. And there's also 2 different kinds of actors in that system that you described. There's like the human who is good at like ambiguity and enjoys like solving problems. And then there's like the computer actor who does not like ambiguity and needs everything to be very uniform and can't figure out how to fix a problem if it runs into one. It just panics or throws back a 500. So like there's like 2 very distinct kind of actors in the system too. And like this is just super complicated. The clay tablet never ran out of juice or bandwidth or something and you'd run out of space maybe, but like, it was different problems. But I think ultimately this is like an ongoing human thing, and APIs are like a really cool microcosm of it, where we get to try out how to make things evolvable and maybe learn something that becomes relevant to the real world. But I think at the end of the day, it's just communication. It's having this like meta channel where I can be like, hey, Eric, like I'm going to send you a bunch of eggs and I want you to turn them into scrambled eggs or something. And like, oh, well, can't do that because the oven shut down. Okay, I'll stop sending them. Like that's the meta channel from like, the kitchen. And then there's like this meta channel for these technology systems too, where like, yeah, sometimes we're going to change something and you need to know about it. And that's the part where the actors and the systems need to readjust. And like the way you make things evolvable is you just make sure those conversations happen before things break, because every time something gets to the break, people eventually fix it. Like that's the dirty little secret is when you do break an API, the banking app eventually updates so that people can keep using it. So like everyone upgrades eventually, but the cultural memory of the pain of that break and the consequence of that break stops us from wanting to evolve again later. So there's all these different human, like I said, I'll die on the hill of this being a human problem.
That last sentence was really nice, right? It's like we run through this pain, and then that pain kind of like we absorb it, and that keeps us from doing things that maybe we should be doing. But I'm totally with you there. It's like I also I firmly believe that yes, the better we can find that balance between some, let's say, technical evolvability, but also being able to figure out that, oh, and now we actually need to talk to those people because we can't handle this on a purely mechanical level. I think the better we get to making the right decision, which way to go, right, the better it is. And I personally, I don't really buy into this nirvana or even like this ideal of building APIs that are, I don't know, like self-healing and finding always a new replacement or whatever. It's like, yeah, that I don't know, that sounds like a nice research path to follow maybe, but so far I think progress is not great. So
well,
I
my whole
think tooling,
is,
tooling like Optic, I think really is kind of a very pragmatic way of saying, okay, until we found nirvana, let's work on it a little differently.
and isn't the whole point of a nirvana that we never get there? Like it's the North Star that we follow.
I don't even know exactly how nirvana is defined, but
I think if you're able to get there, it's not nirvana, but that might be
oh,
mixing that up with utopia. Um, but uh,
okay.
but yeah, I think that at the end of the day, the way you move fast without breaking things is that you start this conversation. And then also, I encourage people who use Optic to break their APIs. It's not about preventing breaks, it's about making the breaks responsibly. And that has allowed people to reduce the surface area, to create better relationships with their consumers. And like, you have no idea how happy some people are to be asked for the first time, hey, we're thinking about changing this. Is this okay? Instead of here's the new thing.
Yeah.
Like just that alone, like, these people are friends now. Like I can't even quantify how valuable that was because I created a relationship in the real world between two people that work at the same company that didn't have one before. Like that is a whole other level of value that might lead to a better design later. And I think at the end of the day, like that side channel, I'm almost don't even want to call it a side channel. It's like, how do you create this cultivated conversation that allows things to change and evolve? And that to me is like the thing that is important. And I think a lot of stuff can be automatically like self-healed and detected maybe, but I would argue that if we all depended on that, then we would add a whole other class of problems, which is like now we don't know how to evolve things because we're so used to things always self-healing. Like there's externalities to that externality, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, there definitely are, and I think there's a good reason why at least that kind of the move fast and break things like that thing, right? Where at least I think if you're not scared of moving fast, right, you're getting more used to like, well, if I break things, how do I fix things, right? So at least you're getting better at that. So I think that is also one of the things that you mentioned, right? It's if I'm less scared of moving, then everybody gets more used to what that means, and at least the system can evolve, right? And not everybody just sitting there and like hoping that nothing will ever change, because then at least it keeps doing what it does, and that's good enough.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
think that's sometimes the kind of and that's less and less like something that you can get away with, right? That used to be the case. Maybe when you build an accounting system, you can say, okay, we'll keep running the accounting system for the next 10 years, and that's maybe good enough.
Mm-hmm.
If what you're doing is actually relevant for your business and IT, right? You can't just keep it running for 10 years.
Yeah.
That's not going to work.
And you can definitely like leave, like there are definitely companies that have like their account system, their ledger for like at a bank running on a mainframe with like a thin membrane between that and a more evolvable system. And like no one's saying you can't leave that thing in the corner and make sure it never changes, and just make sure that it stays on, and that you change out whatever components are going to fail every couple of years. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think the part of the business that needs to move quickly and needs to be experimental and iterable, the last thing you want is to have this shadow in the back of your mind that's stopping you from making changes because you're afraid of the impact it's going to have. And a lot of the time, it's not that big. It's just like, if you talk about it, it's one of those things like ask for forgiveness or ask for permission. Like when it comes to a change, like ask for permission, because not only will you maybe get a yes, I'll do it this week, you might also be able to get a suggestion about how to make it better for that consumer and fit their use case more. Like instead of one API for all, I am almost hoping that one day we have one API per consumer. And like some of the GraphQL stuff is sort of moving that direction where you can explicitly say what you want and get that back. But I think if anything, like the public APIs will be public. Everything else, I could imagine a per consumer kind of relationship and good tools to manage that. And that being like a really nice way to move forward. I'm not advocating that yet because the tools aren't there, but I think there's like something in this thing of like each relation. Don't think of APIs and consumers, think about relationships. And that to me is like this missing part of the conversation today.
Okay, I think these are good closing words, and I think you will have some people who say one API per consumer. That doesn't sound like an API to me, but but then you have people who start thinking about that, and again, right? Maybe there's a good balance somewhere in between, and like you say, there are some patterns that maybe are kind of doing that, but not really, right? Like GraphQL, where it's like everybody can get what they want because there's kind of a language that allows them to do that. So yeah, it's interesting to see all these different ways how the space evolves. And I think the stories you're telling, right, are also, I mean, they're just showing like there's still much more stuff to be done, I think, in that space.
Yeah, that's the exciting part. That's why I like working in this stuff and talking about it. And I hope that at least someone listening comes up with something cool and releases it out to the world based on something they heard here or something that it makes them think of or a tangent or whatever. Like that's the whole reason why we have these conversations, is to hopefully inspire some other people to do great work.
Totally agreed. Aiden, thank you so much for taking the time and speaking with me. I think that was a fascinating conversation. I really love these conversations, just kind of look into the future. And I hope that Optic is going to be successful. I think what you're doing there is really following a very interesting path. And do you have any closing word for us?
I think this has been a great conversation, and if what we've said is interesting, set up a conversation. I'm all over Twitter. Happy to talk about this in the meta philosophical sense, and then also in the hey, I have a problem, help me solve it sense. But this has been great, Eric, and I'm looking forward to hopefully having this conversation at a API conference in a year or so when the world opens up again.
That would be most wonderful. Yes, I hope maybe even less than a year. We'll see. Okay.
Yeah. Good to see you. Thanks so much.
Thanks everybody for joining. Have a great day and see you soon. Bye.